Move aside, Sparta. There's a new power in town. Welcome, Mere Mortalites, to another round of the Mere Mortals book reviews. I'm your host here, Kyron, live on the 6th of August, 2025. And as you might surmise, this is the podcast where I am looking to gather a group of 200 strong men to help me board the ship and sail the seas. Okay, no, we won't be doing that. None of that on this podcast. We will be covering a book, though, where a lot of that happened, which is Lords of the Sea by John R. Hale, with the subtitle, The Epic Story of the Athenian Navy and the Birth of Democracy. So this book was published in 2009, as you might surmise. It's a bit of a history book. 395 pages in length. I'd say it took me 12 hours of reading to fully get through. This was the final book I was reading whilst traveling, so I read this on my Kindle. And yeah, it's a pretty decent account of the period from 438 BC to 322 BC. So this was in the glory of the Athenian naval times, of Athens at its glory, and those two are somewhat linked. And it's not just about Athens and Greece, because it does talk a little bit about Persian wars. It has Alex of Macedonia coming in, Alexander the Great. But they all relate to the Athenian Navy of some shape or form. And so we really see the rise and fall of the armada of Athens, if you want to call it that. The birth, I guess, of their power as a city, I guess, because it wasn't, of Greece as a country, but certainly Athens as a city, via the naval battles with other empires, everything that was going on the seas. And it also links, as the subtitle might suggest, to the rise of democracy and how the political decisions played a part in the birth of the Athenian Navy as well. So what you'll encounter in this book, descriptions of naval battles, you'll encounter well-known figures throughout history of the Athens and ancient Greece, philosophers, artists, etc., etc. It's split into 22 chapters, and the chapters are really either based around a certain time period, or they are based around a person who was influential in that time period. So Pericles, for example, you'll have a kind of a chapter dealing with him, and he might pop his head into other chapters, but that's how it is sorted out in total. So let's jump into the themes and questions. What made the Athenian Navy special, and how is this linked to democracy? So the Athenian Navy were particularly known for their triremes, and this is a type of boat, a long wooden boat manned by 170-ish rowers, and across a kind of couple of different levels. And there would be a small contingent of people on the top side of the boat who were, the oarsmen, the captain, either some fighters perhaps, for example, one guy keeping the beat, multiple different people. So you'd have about 200 people per boat, and the way the boat was utilized was mostly as a ramming type structure. So right at the front of the boat, they would have this ram, and essentially it was to maneuver in battle to get on the broadside of another ship and crash into it. This would then allow them to either break the ship kind of in half and, dismantle it, or for them to kind of get stuck in it so that they could then board and attack and go to hand-to-hand fighting. So depending on the wealth and the ascendancy of Athens at the time, their fleet could consist of as low as kind of 20 to 30 ships, with the associated hundreds getting into thousands of people there, to ships of 200 to 300 in size and number, which were when they were kind of at the peak of their glory and when they would typically be outnumbering other armadas. And there's these interesting battles where you see they themselves kind of get outmaneuvered by other generals, and even though they are greater in number, and then vice versa, when they are kind of rising up as a power, there would be some battles where they were versing the Persians, and they would be outnumbered 3-1, but still managed to pull off a miraculous defeat or victory of the other side. So They were mostly used for kind of these attack purposes, but we could also see them be modified to carry horses, as messenger boats, towing away captured enemy vessels, landing on beachheads. They were the ability to move men around, but particularly they were for the fighting. Later on, they started developing these quadremes or kinremes, which were able to fit more men in and become kind of larger in size. But for the most part, the triremes were the main vessels during this period. So, as I mentioned, this 160-year time period was an eventful time for Greece. This was of many notable things. I'll list a couple of them here. The 300 Spartans, led by King Leonidas at Thermopylae, fighting against the Persians. That was during this time period. The Peloponnesian War, so this was the war between Athens and Sparta themselves. And then finally, the Macedonia's empire building, which included Greece, but obviously went far beyond that. So Athens played its part in all of this by gradually building the dominant maritime empire based on its powerful navy. So as I was reading the book, it becomes apparent, well, it's hard to say. This book had a very particular bent saying this was the Athenian Navy. So it didn't talk about their standing army of hoplites, for example, or battles that they participated in that. It was pretty much just all, here's the navy battles, here's the maritime associated things. And I guess the author is trying to emphasize just how important the Athenian Navy was. They controlled the seas around Greece, won and lost many notable battles, most of which I've forgotten because there were so many in here, and they're kind of not that important historically wise because there's so many naval battles just throughout history. What I also found in this book was a lot of the names that you might recognize throughout ancient Greek history. Pericles, who was the guy who helped to build up the Athenian Navy in the first place. Socrates, the philosopher, who actually was elected at one point to a very critical point of the democracy where they needed a spokesperson, and this would just be drawn by random lots of all the eligible voters. And there was a very influential decision that he kind of presided over, which I will get to in a little bit. And things like people like Euripides, who has the famous plays and was a playwright. Alexander the Great, Alcibiades, who is someone I'd never heard of before, but played a rather important part as well. Thucydides, the historian. Hippocrates, the medical doctor. King Leonidas, obviously from Sparta. I think I mentioned Alexander the Great. Plenty of important people were in this whole time period as a whole, as well as a lot of generals who I'd never heard of before. Phocion was a rather important person, but there's just so many people throughout history, you can't cover really all of them. So getting towards the Navy as itself, and I'm trying to generalize here, what made their Navy so special? And for me, I would say it's because they committed full-heartedly to it. It wasn't just the simple fact of putting resources into it. It's that their whole society and structure was largely built around it. So they literally built Athens. Athens was kind of inland a bit, if you've ever been there, where, or at least the center is in terms of the Acropolis and the Parthenon, things like this. And to protect Athens, they built these long walls all around the city, literally called the Long Walls, which would link Athens to its port, so that they had this kind of joint connection between the port and the actual sea. This isn't that uncommon. There's plenty of walled cities throughout the world. I guess what was interesting of note for this was that it was a very active decision to build this walls to protect themselves and to protect their navy and the ability to house their navy inside a protected barrier, because when you've got hundreds of ships at any given time, they need to be housed somewhere, and this was, I guess, also the foolhardiness. They were protecting their ships and were meticulous with their preparation, of maintenance. They would pull the ships inland. They built special covertures, buildings to house all of these gigantic ships. They would have people training all the time on them and training to learn to row on land. They had, specialized machines they would build so that people could learn how to row properly. The generals were revered. The tactics, all of this kind of played into that Athens became a city based around these ships. And it kind of reminds me of, I guess, the mining industry, funnily enough, which I used to work in, where obviously the mining machines, these gigantic machines, drag lines and diggers and dozers and, the haul trucks and stuff like this. When the mine was going through a good time, these things were maintained meticulously. It was like a point of pride to, have them cleaned, to have any lingering faults fixed and things. Even though it would take away from production, it was still that, there was pride in the machines. And when you go through a bad time, that's one of the first things that starts to go. You start doing less maintenance. You start wearing them down to the ground. And we see a very similar thing that happened with the Athenian Navy. They build themselves up to this tremendous position. They kind of get a bit arrogant. They lose one or two very significant battles through significant missteps by their generals. And then when they're on the way down, it's like, oh shit, we don't have enough ships. We don't have enough men. There's less order. There's less control, and makes them ripe for the picking and overtaking. So as an industry, they were meticulous with not only investing resources, but it's kind of their spirit as well. And so this is where perhaps the Athenian spirit and what the author was maybe linking of the Athenian Navy to their democracy. At various times, slaves were given the offer of, hey, you can become a full Athenian citizen, which was just kind of this rare privileged thing to be able to become an Athenian citizen and perhaps vote as well. Democracy in Athens wasn't everyone gets a vote. It was a lot of people get a vote, but you probably still had to be a landowner and you had to be an Athenian citizen. And for example, if you were an Athenian citizen who married or had sex with someone outside of the city and a child was birthed, they weren't an Athenian citizen. It needed to be between two citizens. So it was a very convoluted item. And but this is where we can see the slaves were given the offer to join the citizenry to man the boats when they were in times of need, when they didn't have enough men to do this. And this obviously came at an extreme risk because they would then have to go to war. If their ship sunk, they were probably going to die out at sea, or they could be sold into worse slavery if they were captured, lots of things like this. So Pericles and other important leaders built up this prestige around the Navy, of pride in it, of power, and this is where we can see they started to win some battles, so then the generals become revered, and the generals, get to speak at the Acropolis during the kind of voting sessions. And, if they're revered, then they're going to speak well about the Navy, so they're going to invest more resources into it. You can see this kind of flywheel of success breeds success. And they certainly built out a lot of infrastructure to help support them with all of this. However, the linkage between democracy and the Navy is a little bit tenuous, so I might touch upon that in the extras section. And you might be thinking like, wow, the Athenian Navy, what a glorious place to be in during those times, and the democracy that enabled them was such a good thing. Like they were making good decisions and stuff like this. But many stories of this time period reminded me of just how brutal it was. So I mentioned Socrates before. There was a battle out at sea. The 8 of the Athenian generals were reported to have not behaved, and these were like the main generals. So, there was only 10 of them in total, I think, in this battle. 8 of them were kind of, I guess you'd call it, subpoenaed after the battle for what they had done, which was they had actually won the battle, but they had neglected to pick up the drowning kind of like Athenian soldiers during it because there was a storm that was coming through, and that was the sort of thing you're meant to do. You're meant to go out and pick up the bodies and try and save survivors. But the storm came through, they couldn't do it. They also had the option to, chase after the other, I believe it was maybe the Spartans they beat then. It's hard to remember, there's so many battles. And they come back to Athens glorious, they've won this battle, but then there's some discontent perhaps amongst other soldiers and things like this. They get called up to the Parthenon. Hey, there's these accusations against you. How do you plead? Not guilty. Well, too bad. We vote that you're all guilty. And they all then had to commit suicide via drinking hemlock. Afterwards, the day or two afterwards, the democracy, the people of it, the population were kind of like, oh, all right, we were kind of mad at the time. We probably shouldn't have done that. And we just killed 8 of our, best generals. Whoops. And this happened regularly. The democracy did not mean that the navy and the structure, the system, the hierarchy of power of putting the right people in charge, it didn't. I wouldn't say that democracy made that it was the navy had the best people in charge and that they performed to their best abilities. If anything, I would say that democracy, with all the backfighting, the all infighting, the backstabbing, the subtle power games of scratching this person's back for this sort of thing, meant that you would have people like Alcibiades, and let's not even mention the nepotism of, it's Pericles, his son, he must be really good as well, so let's elect him, even though there's no necessarily good merit in doing that. And so you'd see throughout time that they consistently made bad decisions. They would consistently lose battles that they shouldn't have lost, that they would execute, for example, a whole city, a vassal state, for refusing to obey their orders. The Athenians were not nice people. They were ruthless. Slavery was fine. Imperial tribute forced upon vassal cities. They were overtaxing these kind of like cities that were within their realm. They would regularly go on these kind of raids to just basically fuck up, plunder, steal, rape, I'm sure all of the bad things, from people who were kind of nominally their allies. They weren't necessarily like set in stone allies, but they also weren't enemies per se. There's so many things where you just look at them and you go, these are a warlike bunch of assholes, and it's very, poetic that they got to this period of power, of building up their navy and becoming like, Athens is a global power at the time. And to then see them get their just desserts afterwards was, I guess, not satisfying, but it's kind of predictable that you behave like arseholes, well, get ready to get humbled by Alexander the Great, for example. So, there was all of these things where you go, democracy and the Athenian naval power were linked, but neither of them were particularly great. They had their moment in the sun for a brief kind of 50 years in this building up the navy, 50 years of glory, and then falling down again. And it's an interesting tale, and what made them great was what led to their own demise. The kind of work, the spirit that they put into it. It's the classic kind of like four things, good men create great times create weak men create bad times create strong men, or good men create good times. It's that kind of cycle that goes over, and we see it. We saw all of it through the period of Athens during this time period. So let's jump on to the author, some extra details. John R. Hale was born 1951, still alive. He's an archaeologist, specialized in ancient history. Particularly, I would say, around Athens. His two specialities were kind of ancient Greece, so think of the Oracle of Delphi, things like that, as well as the navy of certain types. So Vikings, he's pretty good at. So his style in the book was not so much an assertion of what happened, but it was kind of descriptive in nature. It was certainly not historical fiction, because there was a very long section at the end of all the notes, and so it was a recounting of what other people have said, with, I guess, adding some of his own details into the mix. So, he's saying this is likely what Pericles thought, this is likely what happened. So you have details of where certain people landed on beachheads, of where 400 Spartans, for example, got trapped on an island, and Athens was able to, sequester them, keep them trapped on this island, and eventually, I believe, ransomed them back to Sparta for it was either money or power or things like this. I thought he did a very decent job of creating the setting, the context, the feeling for the action, without diving too deep into this person said this, or this exact battle happened in this exact way, and there was 3 ships and this ship hit this ship. I think he did a good mix of adding in all of these kind of components to give you an idea of, okay, this is what was actually happening at the time. A detraction that I would have is that the title is somewhat deceptive in a way, or at least confusing, where I thought that he was going to really try and link the democracy to the Navy and say, the democracy enabled this Navy. Whereas I think he was just more pointing out that the Navy was rising and democracy was also rising at the same time, because he certainly did spend a lot of time talking about this is the decisions that they were making in their, parliament, if you want to call it that. This is what they were doing on the Acropolis. This was what would happen after a battle, and they would raise these temples or erect these, offerings and things like this. So we could kind of see a mix between people, of the actual Navy, of some statistics, and all of it combining together. I suppose I probably won't do it here, but it's worth examining the idea of reading primary sources versus sum-ups like this, or a collation. Whilst getting through the final portion of the book, on my Kindle, I can kind of see, I've got maybe 25% of the book still to go. And I reached the end of the last chapter, and I still had 15 to 20%. And that 15 to 20% was essentially the notes that he had of, okay, in this section, this is where perhaps one historian differs from another, or even where primary sources differ. Thucydides said this, but this other guy said this. So what can you take away from that? I think it might give you a bit of a false confidence about particular events, or even how they were viewed perhaps by other people during the time period. Were they viewed as this kind of benefactor, or were they viewed as these warlike assholes? Those are the sorts of things which are hard to tell, because history is written by the victors, and so they were the victors, so there's a lot of history written about them, and written about themselves. So personally, I'd reserve a little bit of judgment in terms of the geopolitics of the time, of individual decisions, but I thought it was decently accurate in terms of descriptions of life on the boat, for example, how the boats were actually constructed, numbers of navies and things like that. Yeah, of boats in the Navy. Everyone likes to exaggerate and under-exaggerate, so those sorts of things take a grain of salt. The only other thing is, I wish I'd actually read this whilst I was traveling through Athens. I think I started reading this as I was already past. So, I was actually in Piraeus and Athens, like a month ago. So it would have been a bit cooler to actually have had the experience of fully reading this book and then going there and seeing, like, holy shit, like, this is where the boats were perhaps stored, and even going to a trireme, because I'm sure there's like a replica trireme somewhere in Athens, and a replica of one of the boat sheds and things like this. So I wish I'd done that, and but nevertheless, Mykonos, Piraeus, Athens I got to see, and so seeing that in real life gave me a feeling for like, oh, this is the type of weather they would have been going on. Oh, these are the beachheads that they likely would have landed on, or where the Spartans could have been trapped, and things like this. So that was pretty cool. It's nice having a ability to visually see and have been in a place where you're reading a historical book about it. So jumping on to the summaries, similar books, recommendations. I think it was a really good book. Very easy to read, and I found myself paying attention to almost everything that was going on. Sometimes history books can be rather boring if they're listing out too many statistics, if they're being too historical in a way. I think it's a very fine balance to try and read the original sources versus a kind of collation of them. So I thought he did a very good job of that. I'm not even that interested in ancient Greece as a whole, or and especially in navies and armadas and battles like that. But I really was getting stuck into this, and felt like I learned a lot from it. So we regularly hear about the famous people throughout history. So putting into a time context of, okay, this is where Socrates was in comparison to Alexander the Great. This is where Aristotle was in during this time period, things like this. So I feel it's given me more of an appreciation of Athens, of ancient Greece, and just how important their navy was. So overall, I'm going to give Lords of the Sea by John R. Hale a very solid 7.5. No, 7.5 is too much. 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10. It was good. What are some similar books recommendations? Well, if you're onto wanting to know about history and navies, Nathaniel's Nutmeg, I read by Giles Milton a while ago, deals with this, but that was more in the spice trades in the, I'm going to say just the 1600s time period, maybe 1700s, around then. I would also say Sailing True North by James Stavridis, which Juan covered on this channel a long time ago, was probably good. Medea and Other Plays by Euripides. We've covered some Socrates books in here before. Perhaps even Life on the Mississippi, if you want to know just about boats and what it's like to live a boating lifestyle, but in a completely different context. All of those are books that we've personally covered on the channel here before, so you could go check them out, or even better, go read them yourselves. So this is a value for value podcast. I do all of this upfront, give this value to you free. There's never going to be ads, sponsorships, things like that. All I ask is that you provide some value in return. So simple things, liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing it with a friend. Word of mouth is pretty critical to podcasts like this and to reviews like this. I want to know your thoughts on this review. I want to know your favorite books as well. What are some things you would recommend to me? Please leave a comment down below or reach out to us via the social media. And then if you would like to contribute in terms of some money, because all of this requires time and energy and cost in terms of lights and things like this, there are some links down below. We have a PayPal, and you could also send us in a boost via a modern podcasting app. If you go to meremodelspodcast.com/support, we've got some options there for how you can do that. So final section here, what's coming up? Just a little reminder, I do these live 11 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time on a Wednesday. I would love for you to join, like Juan has done here in the chat. And he actually was doing this beforehand, so he's asking me about what I thought. Did it over-romanticize the Athenians? Nope. I thought it was a pretty good, balanced book review. So that is one thing to consider. What's coming up? So I'm going slightly away from my financial history books and more into history/Asia as a whole. So I'm reading Chip Wars at the moment, which is all about the semiconductor industry and integrated circuits and how that industry has worked and probably getting to how it does work. So I'm reading that at the moment. I've got a couple of Lee Kuan Yew books. I think I've got one called The Lessons of History. It's very short. That'll be the next one coming up in this book review channel. And one also does regular books on, not live, but on Saturdays or in between my weekly episodes. So look out for those as well. Plenty to come for the foreseeable future. So that's it for today. I really hope you're having a fantastic day. Wherever you are in the world, come join me on the high seas. And until the next time, ciao for now. Karen out.